The unexpected encounter. The planet's surface was a wasteland of ash and fire. Broken buildings stood as jagged reminders of what had once been a thriving alien colony. Jake moved cautiously through the destruction, his boots crunching softly against the rubble. His heart pounded in his chest, though he didn't let it show. The enemy was everywhere, their patrols scouring the area for survivors. His mission was clear: get in, gather intel, and get out. But fate had other plans. Jake's sharp eyes caught movement near a collapsed building. At first, he thought it might be another enemy soldier, but then he noticed something odd: a small, trembling figure darting into the shadows. He adjusted his position, pressing his back against a wall for cover, and peered through the cracks of the rubble. What he saw made him freeze. It wasn't a soldier. It was a child. The child was small and thin, with pale blue skin that shimmered faintly under the dying light of the twin suns. She clutched something tightly, a blanket or perhaps a piece of cloth, and darted behind a crumbling pillar. Jake's instincts told him to move on, to ignore it. This wasn't his fight. But as he prepared to leave, he saw someone else. A woman. She appeared from the shadows, her movements careful and deliberate as she pulled the child close. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with dirt, but her eyes were fierce, scanning the area with a mix of fear and determination. She was clearly protecting the child, but she looked exhausted. Jake could tell she wouldn't be able to run for much longer. Then came the sound he dreaded most: heavy boots crunching on gravel. A patrol. Jake pressed himself closer to the wall, his pulse quickening. He counted 3 soldiers moving toward the collapsed building. Their armor glinted under the fiery sky, and their weapons hummed ominously. They were speaking in a guttural alien tongue, but their intent was clear. They were searching. The woman must have heard them too. She pulled the child tighter, whispering something in her native language. The girl nodded but didn't cry. Jake was impressed by her silence, though he knew it wouldn't save them if the patrol got too close. He gritted his teeth. This wasn't his mission. His orders were to avoid engagement unless absolutely necessary. Helping them would only complicate things. But as he watched the soldiers inch closer, he felt a pang in his chest. They wouldn't survive. The woman was desperate, but desperation alone wouldn't save her or the child. Jake knew what would happen if they were caught. He had seen it before. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Jake moved quickly but silently, his training kicking in. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small device, a flash decoy. He adjusted the settings, aiming to draw the patrol's attention away from the building. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the device several meters to the left. The decoy went off with a sharp burst of light and sound, mimicking the discharge of a weapon. The patrol reacted instantly, their weapons raised as they turned toward the noise. Jake didn't wait to see if they took the bait. He darted toward the collapsed building, crouching low to avoid being seen. The woman saw him approach and instinctively stepped back, shielding the child. Her eyes widened in fear and confusion as Jake held up his hands, signaling he meant no harm. "Stay quiet," he whispered. His voice was low but firm, the kind of tone that demanded obedience. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. Jake motioned for them to follow him. The woman clutched the child's hand and moved carefully, her movements almost soundless despite the rubble beneath her feet. Jake led them through the ruins, taking a path he hoped would keep them hidden from the patrol. But luck wasn't on their side. One of the soldiers must have noticed something, because Jake heard a shout behind them. His heart sank as the unmistakable sound of pursuit filled the air. "Run," he said, his voice sharper now. The woman didn't need to be told twice. She scooped up the child and followed Jake as he led them through a narrow alley between 2 collapsed walls. The patrol was close, their footsteps echoing ominously. Jake reached into his pack again, this time pulling out a small smoke grenade. He activated it and tossed it behind them, filling the alley with thick, choking clouds. "Keep moving," he urged. They emerged from the alley into a wider area filled with debris. Jake spotted a small, half-buried tunnel entrance and pointed to it. "In there," he said. The woman hesitated, her eyes darting between Jake and the tunnel. She didn't trust him. That much was clear. But she had no choice. With the child clinging to her neck, she ducked into the tunnel. Jake followed, pulling a piece of debris over the entrance to hide it as best he could. They sat in the darkness, the only sound their ragged breathing. The patrol's footsteps grew louder, then paused just outside the tunnel. Jake's hand tightened on his weapon, ready to act if they were discovered. But after a few tense moments, the footsteps moved away. The patrol was gone. The woman exhaled sharply, clutching the child close. Jake leaned back against the tunnel wall, his mind racing. He had just risked his life for two strangers. Why? He didn't have an answer, but as he looked at the woman and child huddled together, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave them behind. The daring escape. The tunnel was dark and narrow, the air thick with dust, and the faint acrid smell of burning debris. Jake crouched low, his pulse steady but his mind racing. The alien widow, Tilia, held her daughter close, her wide, luminous eyes fixed on him. She didn't speak his language, but her gaze said it all. Fear, hope, and desperation mingled in equal measure. The child clung to her mother's neck, her small blue hands trembling. Jake motioned for them to stay quiet as he pressed his ear to the tunnel wall. The distant thud of boots above sent a shiver down his spine. The enemy patrol was still searching. Time was running out. "This way," he whispered, gesturing for them to follow. The tunnel stretched deeper into the ruins, its walls lined with the jagged remnants of old pipes and wires. Jake moved cautiously, scanning ahead with his flashlight. The beam caught glimmers of movement, rats or insects. He couldn't tell, but the widow flinched at every flicker of light. Her child whimpered softly, and Tilia hushed her in their alien tongue, her voice gentle yet urgent. Jake paused at a fork in the tunnel. One path sloped upward, potentially leading to the surface, while the other descended into deeper, unexplored darkness. He weighed the options quickly. The surface meant exposure, but going deeper could trap them if the tunnels collapsed. "We take the lower path," he decided aloud, though it was more for himself than for them. He motioned for Tilia to stay close as he led the way. The lower tunnel was cramped and cold, the air growing thinner with every step. Jake's mind wandered briefly to his mission. What would Command think of him now? He had abandoned his objective to help strangers, putting himself in direct conflict with protocol. Yet, looking back at Tilia and the child, he felt a sense of purpose that his mission had never given him. Suddenly, a faint hum echoed through the tunnel. Jake froze, raising a fist to signal them to stop. He turned off the flashlight and strained his ears. The hum grew louder, accompanied by the faint whir of machinery. It was a drone, a small recon unit scanning the tunnels for heat signatures. "They're smarter than I thought," Jake muttered under his breath. He crouched down, pulling a thermal suppressor from his pack. "Stay close to the wall," he instructed, his voice low but firm. He activated the suppressor, a small device designed to mask their heat signatures temporarily, and placed it between them and the drone's likely path. The hum drew closer, its eerie sound bouncing off the walls. Jake positioned himself between the drone and the others, gripping his weapon tightly. The faint blue glow of the drone's sensors appeared around the corner, its searchlight sweeping methodically. Jake held his breath. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. The drone paused, its light lingering just inches from their hiding spot. Jake tightened his grip, his finger hovering over the trigger. But after what felt like an eternity, the drone continued down the opposite tunnel, its hum fading into the distance. Jake exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. "Let's keep moving," he said, glancing back at Tilia. She nodded, her face a mixture of relief and determination. The tunnel finally opened into a larger chamber, partially collapsed but still offering a brief reprieve. Jake scanned the area, noting potential exits and hazards. "We'll rest here for a moment," he said, motioning for them to sit. Talia hesitated before lowering herself to the ground, keeping her child close. The girl stared at Jake with wide, curious eyes, her fear momentarily replaced by fascination. Jake pulled a ration bar from his pack and offered it to her. She looked to her mother for approval before taking it cautiously. Her small smile as she nibbled the bar was the first sign of hope Jake had seen all day. Their moment of peace was short-lived. A distant explosion rocked the chamber, sending dust and debris raining from above. Jake's communicator crackled to life, a garbled voice breaking through. "Enemy reinforcements inbound. All units, prepare for extraction." Jake cursed under his breath. The enemy wasn't just searching anymore. They were clearing the area systematically, leaving no survivors. They had to move now. "Come on," he said, helping Talia to her feet. "We need to get to higher ground." The climb back up through the ruins was grueling. The tunnels became narrower, forcing them to crawl through tight spaces. At one point, the child began to cry, her soft sobs echoing in the confined space. Talia whispered soothing words, but Jake knew they were running out of time. When they finally emerged onto the surface, the sight that greeted them was grim. Enemy forces were advancing through the ruins, their vehicles casting long shadows in the fiery glow of the distant city. Jake spotted a ruined transport ship on the horizon. If they could reach it, they might have a chance to escape. "Over there," he said, pointing to the ship. "That's our ticket out of here." Talia didn't understand his words, but she followed his lead, clutching her child tightly. The trek to the ship was perilous, with enemy patrols sweeping the area. Jake used every trick he knew, from setting false trails to creating diversions with his gear. His training had never felt so vital, so personal. By the time they reached the ship, Jake's body was aching, and his supplies were nearly depleted. The transport was barely intact, its hull riddled with holes and its engines charred. But it would have to do. "Stay inside," Jake told Talia as he powered up the controls. The ship groaned to life, its systems barely functioning. The enemy was closing in, their vehicles kicking up clouds of dust in the distance. As the engines sputtered and roared, Jake muttered a silent prayer. "Hold on," he said, gripping the controls tightly. "We're not done yet." With a deafening roar, the ship lifted off, leaving the ruins behind. But Jake knew the real fight was only beginning. The silent bond. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the fractured viewport of the damaged transport ship. Inside, Jake worked feverishly to stabilize the ship's systems. Sparks flew from exposed wires, the console flickering as it struggled to remain functional. Every jolt of turbulence made his hands tighten around the controls. The ship was barely holding together, and the enemy might not be far behind. Behind him, Talia sat huddled on the floor, clutching her child. The girl's blue skin seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, her wide eyes darting between her mother and their human savior. Talia whispered softly to her, her alien language melodic but tinged with exhaustion. Jake glanced back briefly, his gaze meeting Talia's. She gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared predicament. "Hang in there," Jake said, though he wasn't sure if they understood him. His voice was calm, but inside, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down hard. These two lives depended entirely on him. Finally, the ship leveled out, the hum of the engines evening into a steady rhythm. They were flying, but not safely, not yet. Jake set the autopilot and turned to face them. He crouched beside Talia, noticing the deep lines of stress etched into her face. The child had fallen asleep, her tiny head resting against her mother's shoulder. "We've got some time," Jake said softly, as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile peace. He motioned toward a small storage compartment nearby. "There might be something to eat in there." Talia hesitated but then gently shifted her child to a more comfortable position and moved toward the compartment. Jake followed, helping her pry it open. Inside, they found a few ration packs and a canister of water. The food wasn't much, but it would keep them going. As they ate in silence, Jake observed them closely. He was used to reading people, body language, subtle cues, but Talia's alien nature made it harder. Still, he could sense her gratitude, even if it wasn't spoken. She tore a piece of her ration and handed it to Jake, a simple gesture of trust that spoke volumes. Jake accepted it with a nod, breaking the quiet. "You're brave," he said, not expecting her to understand. "For her." He motioned toward the child. To his surprise, Talia tilted her head, studying him. Her lips moved, forming words in her language. But then she stopped, as if realizing they wouldn't connect. Instead, she tapped her chest lightly and said, "Talia." Jake smiled faintly, understanding. He tapped his own chest in return. "Jake." Her lips curved into a small, tentative smile, and she repeated his name, her accent soft and unfamiliar. "Jake." The moment was brief but profound. They had started to bridge the gap between them, and though they couldn't speak the same language, there was something universal in their shared struggle. The silent bond between them began to form. Suddenly, a sharp beeping from the console broke the peace. Jake stood quickly, his instincts kicking in. He moved to the controls and scanned the readouts. A proximity alert. Something, or someone, was tracking them. "Talia, stay back," he called, his tone making her tense despite not understanding the words. She pulled her child close, retreating to the corner of the cabin. Jake's fingers danced over the controls, trying to pinpoint the source of the alert. A glance at the radar told him everything he needed to know. A single enemy fighter was closing in fast. It was smaller and more maneuverable than their transport ship, and Jake knew they wouldn't stand a chance in a direct fight. "We're in trouble," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His mind raced as he calculated their options. The transport wasn't equipped for combat, and its engines were barely holding together. But Jake wasn't one to give up easily. He veered the ship into a nearby asteroid field, hoping the debris would provide some cover. The ship groaned in protest as he pushed it to its limits, weaving between jagged rocks and narrowly avoiding collisions. Behind them, the enemy fighter followed relentlessly, its weapons lighting up the dark void with bursts of energy. Talia clung to her child, her fear palpable. Jake's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay focused. He had been in worse situations, or so he told himself. Come on," he muttered, his eyes scanning the controls. Then he saw it, a small energy pulse in the transport systems that could be overloaded to create a brief but powerful burst. It would disable the fighter sensors, but it would also leave their own ship vulnerable. Jake made his decision in an instant. "Talia, hold on to something," he shouted, even though he knew she wouldn't understand. He activated the pulse, and the ship shook violently as the overloaded energy discharged. The cabin lights flickered and dimmed, but the enemy fighter spun out of control, its sensors temporarily blinded. Jake seized the opportunity to put distance between them, steering the transport out of the asteroid field and toward a nearby moon. The ship's engines sputtered, their energy reserves nearly depleted. Jake spotted a rocky outcrop on the moon's surface and brought the ship down for a hard landing. The impact was rough, sending crates and loose debris flying across the cabin. Jake braced himself against the console, his teeth gritted. When the ship finally settled, he exhaled heavily, the tension in his body releasing all at once. He turned to check on Talia and her child. They were shaken but unharmed. The widow looked at Jake, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and awe. Slowly, she extended her hand toward him, a simple, tentative gesture of gratitude and trust. Jake took her hand, giving it a firm but gentle squeeze. "We're not out of this yet," he said, though the words were as much for himself as for her. "But we'll make it." As the three of them sat in the damaged ship on the desolate moon, Jake felt the weight of their silent bond growing stronger. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were a team. The pursuit intensifies. The moon's surface was cold and barren, with jagged rocks and endless shadows stretching as far as the eye could see. Jake leaned against the side of the damaged transport ship, catching his breath. The crash landing had taken its toll on the ship, and the proximity alert had gone silent, but he knew better than to relax. The enemy wasn't far behind. Inside the ship, Talia cradled her daughter, who had fallen asleep despite the chaos. The dim light from a flickering panel illuminated her face, etched with worry and exhaustion. Jake could see her glancing at him through the cracked viewport, her eyes questioning what would come next. He tightened the straps of his gear, checking his weapon and the few remaining supplies in his pack. The ship wasn't going anywhere. Its engines were fried, and the power systems barely functioned. Staying here meant waiting for the enemy to find them, and Jake wasn't one to wait for trouble. He stepped back into the ship, his boots crunching on the broken panels. Talia looked up, her child still nestled in her arms. She spoke softly in her alien tongue, her voice steady despite the fear behind her words. Jake couldn't understand her, but he could feel her trust. It was fragile but growing. "We can't stay here," Jake said, crouching to meet her gaze. He pointed toward the ship and shook his head, then gestured toward the vast, shadowy terrain outside. "We have to move." Talia tilted her head, her brows furrowing in confusion. Jake searched for another way to communicate. He pointed at himself, then at her and the child, then mind running. Her eyes widened as she seemed to grasp his meaning. Slowly, she nodded. Jake handed her a small flashlight and motioned for her to follow. He carried the child for her, noticing how light the girl was compared to a human child. Talia hesitated at first, watching him closely, but when she saw how carefully he held her daughter, she relaxed. The silent bond between them deepened with every step. The trio ventured into the moon's rocky wilderness, the sharp winds cutting through the silence. Jake kept his pace steady but deliberate, scanning the terrain for threats. The moon's uneven surface provided some cover, but it also made for treacherous footing. Talia stumbled a few times, but Jake was quick to steady her. Hours passed as they trekked across the harsh landscape. Jake's military training kept him alert, his senses honed to pick up even the faintest signs of danger. He noticed small, glowing markers embedded in the ground, evidence of ancient alien technology. The markers pulsed faintly, their energy long since depleted. They offered no help but reminded Jake that this desolate place had once been inhabited. Then, faintly, Jake heard it, the low hum of an engine in the distance. He froze, raising a hand to signal Talia to stop. She obeyed instantly, clutching his arm as her eyes darted around in fear. The child stirred in his arms, but Jake gently hushed her, his voice barely above a whisper. The sound grew louder. Jake crouched behind a large rock, pulling Talia and the child with him. He motioned for Talia to stay low and quiet as he peered over the edge of their hiding spot. His heart sank when he saw what was approaching. A small reconnaissance vehicle hovered across the terrain, its searchlights sweeping methodically. It was a scout, likely sent to locate them before the larger forces arrived. Jake knew they couldn't let it find their trail. "Stay here," Jake whispered to Talia, placing her child back in her arms. He mimed a wait gesture and then moved silently around the rock, keeping to the shadows. The scout vehicle drew closer, its engine emitting a faint whine. Jake crept toward it, his movements precise and calculated. He had one chance to disable it without alerting the main forces. As the vehicle passed by his position, Jake darted out, his weapon raised. With a swift, well-aimed shot, he hit the vehicle's power core. Sparks flew as the engine sputtered, and the vehicle tilted precariously before crashing to the ground. Jake quickly approached, his weapon ready, but the pilot was already incapacitated by the crash. He dismantled the vehicle's communication system, ensuring no distress signal could be sent. Satisfied, Jake returned to Talia and the child. She looked at him with a mixture of awe and relief, her lips moving as if to speak, but she remained silent. Jake nodded, urging them to continue their journey. They couldn't afford to linger. The scouts' absence would eventually raise suspicion. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, the terrain grew more hostile. Razor-sharp rocks jutted out at odd angles, and the winds howled through narrow crevices. Jake spotted a small cave in the distance, a potential place to rest and regroup. He led Talia inside, checking the space thoroughly before allowing them to settle. The cave was cold and dark, but it offered a brief reprieve from the relentless pursuit. Jake lit a small flare, its warm glow illuminating the space. Talia sat with her child, her body visibly trembling from exhaustion. Jake handed her a thermal blanket from his pack, and she wrapped it around herself and her daughter. For the first time in hours, they had a moment of peace. Jake sat across from them, his back against the cave wall. He could feel Talia watching him, her gratitude unspoken but clear. The child, now awake, reached out toward him, her tiny fingers brushing against his hand. Jake smiled faintly, his resolve hardening. He had promised himself he would protect them, and he intended to keep that promise, no matter what it cost. Outside, the winds howled, masking the distant sound of engines. The pursuit hadn't ended, it had only just begun. The safe haven. The cave provided a brief respite, but Jake knew it wouldn't last. The enemy was relentless, and their scouts' disappearance would only fuel their pursuit. As the winds outside carried the distant rumble of engines, Jake's mind raced to formulate a plan. Talia watched him from across the cave, her child curled up in her arms. Her eyes, though filled with exhaustion, radiated a silent determination. Jake admired her resilience. Despite everything, she hadn't faltered. But he also knew that determination alone wouldn't save them. "We need to keep moving," Jake said aloud, more to himself than to her. He crouched by his pack, pulling out the last of his supplies. A ration bar, a single water canister, and a portable thermal suppressor, barely enough for the trek he had in mind. He activated his communicator, scanning for any signals in the area. To his relief, a faint beacon flickered on the screen, a waypoint marked by old resistance forces. It was several kilometers away, hidden deep within the rugged terrain. If they could reach it, they might find shelter, supplies, and possibly a way off the moon. Jake knelt by Talia, pointing to the beacon on the small screen. "Safe," he said, keeping his words simple. He gestured toward her child, and then to the distance. "We go." Talia's brow furrowed as she studied the device. She didn't understand his words, but she seemed to grasp the urgency in his tone. With a nod, she stood, her child stirring slightly in her arms. Jake adjusted his gear, slinging his weapon across his back, and led them out of the cave. The trek was grueling. The terrain grew steeper, the jagged rocks cutting into their boots and slowing their progress. Jake carried the child for much of the journey, allowing Talia to conserve her energy. Despite her exhaustion, she kept pace, her determination driving her forward. As they approached the waypoint, the landscape began to change. The rocky expanse gave way to a series of narrow canyons, their walls marked with strange, ancient carvings. Jake stopped, his instincts tingling. The carvings were unfamiliar, but they hinted at something more than just a hiding spot. "This doesn't look like any resistance base I've seen," he muttered. He glanced back at Talia, who stared at the carvings with a mix of awe and recognition. She touched one of the symbols lightly, her fingers tracing its intricate patterns. Jake decided to press on, keeping his weapon at the ready. The waypoint's signal grew stronger as they descended into the canyon. The air grew cooler, and the faint sound of running water echoed in the distance. After hours of climbing and crawling, they reached the entrance to an underground shelter. It was hidden behind a natural waterfall, the shimmering water masking the entrance from view. Jake pushed through the cascading stream, finding a small control panel embedded in the rock. He tapped a few buttons, and with a groan of ancient machinery, the entrance slid open. The shelter was dark and musty, but it was intact. Rows of supply crates lined the walls, and old machinery hummed faintly, still operational after years of abandonment. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. They had found their safe haven. At least for now. Talia stepped inside cautiously, her eyes wide as she took in the space. Jake set the child down gently, allowing her to explore while he inspected the shelter. He found rations, medical supplies, and even a small energy generator. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them alive for a few days. As Jake worked, Talia approached him, holding one of the ration bars he had placed on a crate. She handed it to him, her expression soft. Jake shook his head, motioning for her to eat it herself. "You need it more than I do," he said, even though she didn't understand. The gesture wasn't lost on her. She smiled faintly, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from her since their journey began. It was a small moment of connection, but it strengthened the bond between them. As they settled in, Jake examined the shelter's defense systems. The perimeter sensors were still functional, though barely. He activated them, setting up a rudimentary alarm system in case the enemy drew near. The shelter wasn't impenetrable, but it would give them a fighting chance. Night fell on the moon, its twin suns sinking below the horizon and plunging the landscape into darkness. Inside the shelter, Jake sat by a small heater, his weapon within arm's reach. Talia and her child rested nearby, their breathing steady as they slept. Jake's thoughts drifted to Earth, to the life he had left behind. He had always followed orders, never questioning the missions he was given. But this, saving Talia and her child, felt different. It wasn't about duty or protocol. It was about doing what was right. His musings were interrupted by a faint beep from the perimeter sensors. Jake tensed, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. He moved to the console, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the readout. A single blip appeared on the screen. Something or someone was approaching. "Talia," he said softly, moving to wake her. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Jake motioned for her to stay quiet, pointing toward the entrance. The blip grew closer, and Jake positioned himself near the doorway, his weapon raised. The tension in the air was palpable as he waited, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed from the entrance. Jake's finger hovered over the trigger as a shadow appeared beyond the waterfall. He braced himself for a fight, his heart pounding in his chest. But when the figure stepped into the shelter, Jake froze. It wasn't an enemy soldier. It was a lone traveler, their body covered in ragged clothing and their face obscured by a hood. They raised their hands in a gesture of surrender, their voice hoarse as they spoke. "Don't shoot," the traveler said in broken English. "I mean no harm." Jake's grip on his weapon tightened as he studied the stranger. Friend or foe, their arrival meant one thing: the pursuit wasn't over. The final stand. The strangers stood frozen in the dim light of the shelter, their hood casting a shadow over their face. Jake's weapon didn't waver, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. Talia moved silently behind him, clutching her daughter tightly. The air in the room was thick with tension, every second stretching unbearably long. "Take off the hood," Jake ordered, his voice low and commanding. The figure complied slowly, revealing a face weathered by time and hardship. The traveler's features were humanoid, but faint ridges along their brow and their slightly luminescent eyes marked them as an alien. They looked tired, their posture slouched from exhaustion. They raised their hands higher, palms outward in a universal gesture of peace. "I mean no harm," the traveler said again, their voice raspy. "I seek refuge, just like you." Jake's grip on his weapon didn't loosen. Refuge from who? The traveler hesitated, their glowing eyes darting toward Talia and her child before returning to Jake. "The same ones hunting you," they said carefully. "They'll be here soon. You must prepare." Jake's stomach sank. He had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed by an outsider solidified the urgency of the situation. He motioned for the traveler to step inside, his weapon still trained on them. "You've got 2 minutes to explain. Who are you, and how do you know they're coming?" The traveler sat on the cold floor, visibly relieved to be off their feet. "My name is Corvin," they began. "I was part of a resistance cell that operated in this region years ago. This shelter," they gestured around them, "was one of our safe houses, but the enemy found us, one by one. I've been on the run ever since." Jake didn't lower his weapon, though he could sense the truth in Corvin's words. "And the patrols? How close are they?" Corvin's expression darkened. "Too close. Their scout didn't report back. They'll send a full squadron to sweep this area." Jake cursed under his breath. The scout vehicle he had taken out had bought them some time, but not much. The shelter, though defensible, wasn't built to withstand a prolonged attack. If the enemy came in force, their chances of survival were slim. "We need a plan," Jake said, his voice firm. He turned to Talia, his gaze softening as he gestured toward a small alcove in the corner of the shelter. "You and your child stay there. No matter what happens, don't come out unless I say it's safe." Talia didn't need to understand his words to grasp his meaning. She nodded, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. She took her daughter and retreated into the shadows, her presence almost invisible against the dim light. Jake turned back to Corvin. "Do you know the terrain around here? Any choke points or natural defenses we can use?" Corvin nodded. "There's a narrow pass just beyond the waterfall. If we can funnel them there, it'll limit their numbers. But it's a risk. If they overwhelm us, there's no way out." Jake considered the options. The pass would give them an advantage, but it meant leaving the relative safety of the shelter. "We'll use it," he said decisively. "It's better than waiting here to be surrounded." They spent the next hour preparing. Jake set up makeshift traps along the pass using old resistance equipment he found in the shelter. Tripwires rigged to explosives, sharpened spikes hidden beneath loose rocks. Corvin proved resourceful, his familiarity with the area invaluable. As the suns began to rise over the horizon, the distant rumble of engines shattered the quiet. Jake and Corvin took their positions at the pass, crouching low behind the jagged rocks. Through his scope, Jake spotted the enemy vehicles, sleek, angular machines designed for speed and firepower. At least a dozen soldiers marched alongside them, their weapons gleaming under the pale light. "They're splitting up," Corvin whispered. "Half will sweep the shelter while the rest take the pass." Jake nodded grimly. He had anticipated this. "We hold them here as long as we can. If they breach the shelter—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. The first vehicle entered the pass, its engines humming ominously. Jake waited, his fingers steady on the trigger. When the vehicle reached the tripwire, he squeezed the detonator. The explosion was deafening, the vehicle flipping into the air before crashing in a fiery heap. The soldiers shouted, their formation breaking as they scrambled for cover. Jake opened fire, his shots precise and deadly. Corvin joined in, his weapon emitting bursts of energy that cut through the enemy ranks. The narrow pass forced the soldiers to cluster together, making them easy targets. But as more vehicles pushed through, the tide began to turn. "They're bringing heavier armor," Corvin shouted, pointing to a large, tank-like vehicle advancing steadily despite the rocky terrain. Jake cursed. The traps wouldn't stop that behemoth. "Fall back," he ordered, covering Corvin as they retreated toward the shelter. The battle raged on, the sound of gunfire echoing through the canyon. Jake and Corvin fought with everything they had, but the enemy's numbers were overwhelming. As they reached the shelter, Jake glanced back to see the tank lining up its cannon, aimed directly at the entrance. "Get down," he yelled, grabbing Corvin and diving into the shelter just as the cannon fired. The blast shook the entire structure, debris raining from the ceiling. Talia screamed, clutching her daughter as they huddled in the corner. Jake scrambled to his feet, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. The shelter wouldn't hold much longer. Desperation clawed at his chest as he searched for a solution. Then he saw it, a small panel on the wall marked with ancient symbols. It was an emergency power conduit, likely linked to the old resistance network. Jake had no idea if it still worked, but it was their only shot. "Corvin, cover me," he shouted, rushing to the panel. He ripped off the cover, exposing a series of wires and circuits. His hands moved quickly, reconnecting the damaged system. Sparks flew as the conduit powered up, its energy flowing into the shelter's remaining defenses. Outside, the enemy forces pushed forward, their weapons trained on the shelter. But as they neared the entrance, a blinding surge of energy erupted from the ground, sending shockwaves through the pass. The enemy soldiers were thrown back, their vehicles disabled by the electromagnetic pulse. Jake slumped against the wall, his body trembling with exhaustion. The pulse had drained the last of the shelter's power, but it had bought them precious time. "We're not done yet," he muttered, his resolve unshaken. The enemy would regroup, but so would he. And this time, he wouldn't just defend. He'd strike back. A new beginning. The shelter was silent, save for the faint crackling of damaged systems trying to reboot. Jake leaned heavily against the wall, his breath ragged, his body aching from the battle. The electromagnetic pulse had worked, buying them enough time to regroup, but it had come at a cost. The shelter was now completely powerless, and any reinforcements from the enemy were likely regrouping outside the blast radius. Corvin slumped beside him, his weapon resting on the ground. "That was close," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Jake nodded, his gaze shifting toward Tilia and her child. They were safe, huddled together in the corner, but their eyes reflected the trauma of the chaos. He couldn't leave them here. This wasn't survival anymore. It was about finding a new beginning for all of them. "We can't stay," Jake said, his voice firm despite the exhaustion weighing him down. "They'll send more, stronger this time. We need to move while we can." Corvin tilted his head, considering. "There's an old resistance transport buried near here. It hasn't flown in years, but if we can power it up, it might be our way off this moon." Jake's mind sharpened at the idea. "How far?" 2 kilometers. "Through the canyon," Corvin replied. "It'll be risky, but it's our only chance." Jake wasted no time. He crossed the room to Talia, kneeling beside her. He gestured to the child, then pointed to himself and mimed carrying her. "We're leaving. It's not safe here." Talia's eyes widened, but she nodded. She didn't need to understand his words. She trusted him now. Jake picked up the girl, who clung to him instinctively, her small hands gripping his jacket. Talia followed close behind, as Corvin led them out of the shelter and into the rocky expanse. The last trek. The canyon was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. Every shadow seemed to hold the possibility of danger. Jake kept his weapon ready, his senses heightened. Corvin moved ahead, scouting the path, while Telia and her daughter stayed close to Jake. The journey was slow and grueling. The uneven terrain forced them to climb and crawl, their movements cautious to avoid detection. Jake could feel the weight of the child in his arms, but he didn't falter. Her safety mattered more than his discomfort. As they neared the site Corvin had described, the faint outline of a buried transport came into view. Its hull was partially covered by rocks and debris, its once sleek design dulled by years of abandonment. Jake's heart sank at the sight. It looked worse than he had imagined. "This is it," Corvin said, brushing dirt off the transport's hatch. "If we can get it running, we have a chance." Jake set the child down, motioning for Talia to stay with her. He joined Corvin at the hatch, using his tools to pry it open. The door groaned as it gave way, revealing a dark interior that smelled of rust and decay. Inside, the transport was a mess. Broken panels hung from the walls, and the controls were coated in layers of dust. Jake moved to the cockpit, flipping switches and reconnecting wires. The power system sputtered, but the faint hum of the engines gave him hope. "It's got fuel," Jake said, relief washing over him. "Barely, but enough to get us out of here." Corvin nodded, already working on rerouting power to the engines. "I'll handle the flight systems. You get them on board." Jake returned to Talia, gesturing for her to follow him into the transport. She hesitated, her eyes scanning the battered vehicle, but when her daughter reached for Jake, she stepped inside. He guided them to the passenger seats, strapping them in securely. The escape. The engines roared to life, shaking the entire transport as it struggled to lift off. Outside, the distant rumble of enemy vehicles grew louder. They were closing in. "Hurry it up, Corvin," Jake shouted from the cockpit, his hands flying over the controls. "Almost there," Corvin yelled back, frantically adjusting the flight systems. The transport shuddered as it broke free from the ground, its thrusters igniting. Jake pulled the controls, steering it upward. The rocky canyon walls blurred past them as they ascended, the sound of enemy fire echoing below. Come on," Jake muttered, his grip tightening on the controls. A sudden blast rocked the transport, an enemy missile grazing the hull. Warning lights flashed across the console, but the ship held together. "They've locked onto us," Corvin shouted, checking the radar. "We won't make it if they send more fighters." Jake's mind raced. He activated the transport's countermeasures, deploying chaff and flares to confuse the enemy's targeting systems. The strategy worked, buying them precious seconds as the transport broke through the moon's atmosphere and into the cold expanse of space. A new beginning. The silence of space was a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. Jake exhaled deeply, his muscles relaxing for the first time in hours. The transport's engines hummed steadily, and the warning lights dimmed. They had made it, at least for now. Corvin slumped into the co-pilot's seat, his face pale but relieved. "We're clear, for now," he said. "But we need a destination." Jake nodded, pulling up a star map on the console. He found a small neutral colony within range, a place that offered refuge to war-torn families. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He turned to Talia, who sat with her daughter in her lap, her eyes filled with both gratitude and uncertainty. Jake pointed to the map, then to her and her child. "Safe," he said simply. Talia didn't understand the word, but the look in her eyes told him she understood his intent. She reached out, placing her hand over his. It was a silent gesture of trust, one that spoke louder than words. As the transport sailed through the stars, Jake felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was their protector, their hope for a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, he believed in the possibility of a better future.